It never begins with violence. Not at first. It begins with something quieter, control disguised as care, power disguised as protection. And somewhere, far beneath the surface, it begins with fear. When people hear the term Stockholm Syndrome, they often think of it as something extreme. Hostages falling in love with their captors, prisoners defending those who lock them away. But the truth is far more subtle, far more common, and far more human than most realize. Because Stockholm Syndrome is not really about love. It is about survival. It is about what the mind does when it has no other way to stay safe. In August of 1973, a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden turned into a 6-day hostage crisis. The captives, held in a vault, began to emotionally bond with their captors. They defended them, protected them, and even after their release, some refused to testify. The world was stunned. How could this happen? But to those who understand trauma, it made perfect sense. When your nervous system perceives threat, it activates one of several survival responses: fight, flight, freeze, and another lesser-known one, fawn. Fawning is the attempt to appease a threat, to win over danger, to emotionally merge with the very thing that terrifies you, because sometimes aligning with the threat feels safer than resisting it. And that is where Stockholm Syndrome begins. Not with attraction, with appeasement. The abused child who clings to the violent parent is not confused. She is adapting. She knows, perhaps not consciously but biologically, that fighting back might lead to more pain. So she learns to smile, to comply, to predict their moods, to say the right thing at the right time. And slowly, the line between protection and captivity begins to blur. This same dynamic happens in abusive relationships. It does not matter if the abuser is a partner, a parent, a boss, or a leader. What matters is that they create a climate of fear, unpredictability, and emotional dependency. The victim may feel powerless to leave, but more than that, they feel emotionally bonded. They begin to see the abuser's anger as strength, their manipulation as passion, their cruelty as woundedness, and in trying to survive them, they begin to humanize them, even protect them. Psychologist Judith Herman, one of the most respected voices in trauma research, describes this process as a form of traumatic bonding. It is not weakness. It is not naivety. It is the mind's desperate attempt to restore some form of coherence in an incoherent reality. Imagine being isolated, controlled, stripped of agency. Your only human contact is with someone who shifts between rage and affection. In that context, receiving a kind word, a small gesture, even just being spared, can feel like a lifeline. Over time, you begin to interpret these moments not just as relief, but as signs of care. You develop emotional ties, not because the captor is kind, but because your brain has learned to attach wherever safety might appear. Stockholm Syndrome, then, is not a defect. It is a survival strategy. But like all survival strategies, it comes with a cost. Because in protecting the abuser, the victim slowly turns against themselves. They suppress their fear, their anger, their confusion. They rewrite the narrative. They say, "He is not that bad," or "She only hits me when she is upset." They carry the weight of the abuse as if it were a test they failed, not a violation they endured. This internal conflict creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs. On one hand, the victim knows something is wrong. On the other hand, they believe they need the abuser to feel safe, loved, or whole. And so they rationalize, they adapt, they blame themselves. The longer this continues, the deeper the bond becomes. Because trauma changes the brain. It rewires attachment. It links fear and affection in confusing ways. The abuser becomes both the source of harm and the source of comfort. And that is the heart of Stockholm Syndrome. Not love for the captor, but a desperate hope that the captor might one day become safe. In many cases, these victims are highly intelligent, emotionally sensitive people. They are not weak. They are not foolish. In fact, their ability to emotionally attune to the abuser, to read subtle cues, to anticipate danger, to empathize with pain, is often a strength that was turned against them. The problem is not their empathy. The problem is how it was used. People with histories of childhood trauma are particularly vulnerable. If you grew up in a home where love was conditional, where safety was unpredictable, where affection came with fear, then your brain may have learned that connection and danger are intertwined. And later in life, when you meet someone who evokes that same emotional rhythm, your nervous system recognizes it. Not as danger, but as familiar, as home. This is why so many people return to abusive partners. Not because they are stupid or addicted to drama or incapable of change, but because their brains have been wired to equate control with safety, criticism with care, and pain with love. Breaking this pattern is not as simple as walking away, because walking away does not erase the bond. It does not erase the belief that maybe, just maybe, the abuser will change. That if you try harder, love deeper, stay longer, they will become the version of themselves they once showed you. That early mask, that first illusion, but that version is not real. It was never real. It was the hook. Many survivors describe the moment they realized they were trapped as one of the most disorienting experiences of their life. They were not chained. They were not locked in a room. They were not free. Their decisions were shaped by fear, their reality by manipulation, their self-worth by the approval of someone who withheld it like a weapon. And yet, to the outside world, everything looked normal. Smiling photos, polite conversations, subtle bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, because the performance was perfect, because the victim learned that exposure was dangerous, that telling the truth might bring punishment, disbelief, or abandonment. So they stayed quiet. They stayed small. They stayed because they were trained to, but somewhere, deep inside, the truth remained, unspoken, waiting, burning quietly beneath the surface of the story they had been forced to tell themselves. And eventually, something happens. A breaking point, a crack in the narrative, a moment of clarity, not always loud. Sometimes it is just a question, a whisper, a realization that the love they were chasing was hurting them. That safety should not require suffering. That real connection does not demand self-erasure. And that is where the story begins to shift. The breaking point is rarely dramatic. More often, it is quiet, a breath that feels unfamiliar, a moment of stillness where the nervous system loosens its grip, a glance in the mirror where you suddenly notice the hollowness in your eyes and think, "This is not who I was meant to be." You do not always run. Sometimes you begin by crawling, by asking questions you had been too afraid to speak aloud. What if love is not supposed to hurt? What if safety does not have to come with silence? What if the person I keep protecting would never do the same for me? And when those questions rise, they do not fade. They haunt. They unravel the lies you once clung to for survival. The idea that it was your fault, that you provoked it, that if you had just been more patient, more quiet, more understanding, the abuse would have stopped. But there is no amount of shrinking that can make someone else whole. And you begin to see that. The process of leaving does not always start with action. It starts with grief. Not grief for the abuser, but grief for yourself. For the years spent waiting to be seen. For the parts of you that were abandoned to keep the peace. For the dreams silenced beneath someone else's control. Healing from Stockholm Syndrome is not a straight line. It is a labyrinth. There are days you feel free, days you feel guilty, days you want to go back. Not because it was better, but because it was familiar. The nervous system is slow to catch up. It still flinches. It still mistrusts ease. It still scans for danger, even in the arms of gentleness. That is not weakness. That is the echo of survival. One of the most painful truths survivors face is how much they miss the person who hurt them. And that is something society rarely understands. People expect clean breaks. They expect rage and clarity. But what most survivors carry is confusion. Not because they do not understand what happened, but because they remember the kindness too. They remember the rare moments of softness, the times their captor laughed, the flickers of humanity that made everything else harder to reconcile. But here is the thing. A moment of kindness does not erase a pattern of cruelty. A tender gesture does not cancel manipulation. Abusers often know exactly when to be soft, because softness is the hook. It is how they keep the story going. In the recovery process, therapy becomes not just useful, but life-saving. A trauma-informed therapist helps survivors untangle the emotional knot between love and fear, between protection and captivity. One method often used is called parts work, a process where the therapist helps the survivor speak to the different parts of themselves. The scared child who wanted to be loved, the loyal protector who stayed, the new voice, quiet but growing, that says, "You deserved better." Dr. Janina Fisher, a leading trauma specialist, describes how the body holds on to trauma long after the conscious mind moves forward. Survivors may intellectually understand what happened to them, but still feel frozen in old patterns. That is why healing is not just about understanding. It is about retraining the nervous system to feel safe without control, to recognize that freedom does not mean danger, that love does not mean pain. In some cases, survivors develop complex PTSD, a form of post-traumatic stress rooted in prolonged emotional captivity. Symptoms include emotional flashbacks, chronic guilt, difficulty trusting, and a haunting sense of worthlessness. These are not flaws. They are scars left by a long war, one fought silently, internally, for years. But as the survivor begins to reclaim their identity, small miracles begin to happen. They start to say no, even when their voice shakes. They start to feel anger, not as violence, but as clarity. They stop explaining their pain to those committed to misunderstanding it. They remember things they had forgotten, how they used to laugh, what they used to dream about, the texture of safety they once believed was lost. And sometimes, the people around them do not know how to respond, because transformation threatens comfort. The same friends who once told them to leave may now tell them to calm down. The same family who ignored the signs may now say, "Why are you still holding on to this?" But healing is not a performance. It is a return. And sometimes that return requires losing people who only loved the version of you that stayed quiet. The social pressure to forgive often arrives too early. Survivors are told to let go, to move on, to rise above. But forgiveness is not a shortcut. It is not a requirement. And sometimes it is not even appropriate. What matters more is reclaiming power, naming what happened, making sense of the chaos, and choosing a future no longer shaped by fear. And then comes the hardest part, trust. Trusting new people, trusting your own choices, trusting the calm. Because when you have been in captivity long enough, safety feels like a setup. You wait for the mask to slip, for the affection to vanish, for the storm to return. It takes time, sometimes years, to stop reading every silence as a threat. But it happens, slowly, one safe interaction at a time, one boundary held, one night without nightmares, one moment of joy that does not come with guilt. Some survivors find deep power in advocacy. They write, they speak, they help others escape the very patterns they once thought were permanent. This does not erase what happened, but it alchemizes it. Pain is not meant to be your identity, but when spoken from a healed place, it can become a bridge. Others reclaim life in quieter ways. They grow gardens, they foster animals, they travel, they begin again, and in every act of rebuilding, they prove something sacred, that what was done to them did not destroy their capacity for beauty. That captivity did not erase their imagination. that the part of them that stayed alive, even in silence, was waiting to come back stronger. Psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, writes that trauma is not just an event. It is the way the event lives inside you. Healing, then, is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. It is giving the story back its shape, its meaning, its truth. It is saying, yes, that happened. And no, it no longer defines me. For those still inside the storm who feel trapped, numb, confused, know this: your instincts are not broken. You are not crazy. You are adapting to an impossible situation. And even if your steps are small, even if your voice trembles, even if you still love someone who hurt you, you are allowed to want more. You are allowed to outgrow the cage you once mistook for comfort. You are allowed to leave without a perfect explanation. You are allowed to protect your peace at the cost of someone else's approval. There will always be people who do not understand why you stayed, who cannot comprehend the invisible chains. But you do not owe them your story. You only owe yourself the freedom to write a new one. And in time, you will. You will walk without scanning the room. You will rest without rehearsing your defense. You will love without losing yourself. And when you look back, it will not be to blame, but to bless the version of you that survived, who smiled when it hurt, who played along to stay alive, who dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. There was. And you found it.